Well, it's good to be here in Switzerland, even though it's 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, only the Swiss would start an academic conference at 8 in the morning. We usually wait till 10 in Great Britain. So what I want to talk about is plants as living materials in the landscape. Unlike hard materials, concrete, paving, gravel, etc., which can be laboratory tested, plants are living things which are constantly changing. So there is an unpredictable quality to them. I want to look at how we can assess the long-term performance of plants, specifically perennials, which are increasingly important in designed landscapes, and how we communicate that. Contemporary planting design is moving forward very, very fast. The idea of mixed planting, which was developed in Germany and Switzerland, for example, at Rapperswil, just over the lake, nearly said river, I mean the lake. Here, in that whole genre, planting by Adam Baroš at the Dendrological Park at Průhonice in the Czech Republic. These are very complex plantings. They are designed to be sustainable, to be low maintenance, and to last with minimal intervention. Therefore, we need to be very sure about the plant components, the plant species we're using in these combinations in order to avoid problems. Of course, the worst problem is plants dying, which is always clients get annoyed. Taxpayers get annoyed, and it's bad for the designer if you have plants that die on you. The Dutch designer Piet Oudolf has played a very important role in popularizing the use of perennials and has been extremely experimental in using a wide range of perennials and grasses. This is a new, very experimental area behind his house at Hummelo in the Netherlands. Key to the success of Piet Oudolf's work, okay, he's a very inspired designer, but key to his success is the fact that his plants last. They don't die on you. You don't get that awful kind of dead patch where something has failed. Pete has a very strong intuitive knowledge of plants' long-term of the long-term performance of the species he uses, as indeed have many other successful practitioners. And it's the intuitive nature of this knowledge which makes it difficult to convey and communicate. So what I've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years is running a workshop for practitioners, and they can be amateur gardeners, garden designers, landscape architects, horticulture management professionals, anyone who wants to come along really, running workshops in long-term performance. And I call it the rabbit's eye view, because a lot of it is actually about getting down on hands and knees and looking at what is going on at ground level. Here's my own garden and the Welsh borders, just to show that I do practice what I preach. All very much about assessing plants for their long-term performance. Now, if we look at books, reference books, we can find out what something looks like, when it flowers, what sort of conditions it needs. Does it need sun or shade or moisture, or will it tolerate alkaline soils? You will find very little about long-term performance. How long do these species live? How much do they spread? How much do they self-seed? Any such information given tends to be very scattergun, almost kind of random, and you can, well, I find myself getting rather annoyed sometimes at the sheer lack of information that's given in reference books. So in order to address this, one way of addressing this is to get practitioners to understand plants better, to empower them to look at plants, and from looking at their morphology and their behavior to make predictions about their long-term performance. And that's what my workshop is all about. we are presented with particular problems by plants, these terribly trendy Echinacea hybrids. Go to any garden centre or nursery now, and it's full of these, especially this time of year, full of these things. Well, as anyone will tell you, they don't last very long. Okay for the private garden, but if you are spending taxpayers' money on a local government project and a designed landscape, and you stick in a load of Echinacea, and 2 or 3 years later, 3/4 of them are dead, well, it doesn't look very good, does it? These lovely, colourful new Achillea hybrids, again, the same sort of thing. They work very well for a couple of years, and then they tend to start disappearing. Or there's the other problem. There is species that spread. And in some cases, like the euphorbia here, the spread is fairly predictable. In other cases, such as this Symphytum caucasicum, it is absolutely rampant. So that, again, do we want to be planting species in a landscape that might become weeds? So we've got a number of problems that come up with plantings. Short lifespan is an obvious problem. A slow rate of spread can also be a problem. If plants take several years to establish, then they perhaps are not seen as giving value for money, and more importantly, could be suppressed by the more vigorous growth of neighbouring plants. The opposite problem, that high rate of vegetative spread in some environments, particularly on fertile soils, can mean you end up with a kind of monoculture or something rather than the rich diversity that you'd put down on your drawing board. The high rate of seeding, this is something that is particularly difficult to predict, but high rates of seeding can, at their worst, introduce a new invasive alien into an environment. But on the other hand, for short-lived species, a moderate rate of seeding can result in a spontaneity and a dynamism to a planting that can continue for many years. So we have these various issues, which we could sum up as longevity, plant spread, competition, speed of establishment of growth, and self-seeding. So a number of years ago, I was able to conduct a study based on a questionnaire, which we got out to 66 respondents, looking at these issues. Most of the respondents were private gardeners. We had a handful who were in their 80s and 90s and who had had decades of experience of working with plants. And so that was a great way of checking this material. And my workshop is very much built on this survey. And it was, I won't go into all the detail here, but what it was showing was that many of these very popular plants were not reliably, that many respondents were coming back and saying, you know, these do not live long in the garden. Basically, the lower the figure on the right, the more respondents reported it as being short-lived. The nursery trade is very much geared towards the private gardener. There's not much research and development going into producing cultivars that are good performers for larger scale, long-term projects. And so we find this problem occurring again and again. And again, we hear quite a lot of the plants at the top of this list, for one reason or another, and the reasons are various, actually fail within a number of years. But then we do have, at the other end of the spectrum, a few which we say in English are bomb-proof. They will just carry on growing regardless. Some of the grasses, such as Miscanthus sinensis, Acanthus, many geranium species and cultivars are incredibly good performers and can be used in design landscapes in the secure knowledge that they will carry on performing forever. But we don't want to restrict ourselves to a very narrow portfolio of plants that we know do well. Hence the need to educate practitioners, to get practitioners looking at plants and reading the plant, making their own assessments about how something will perform over time. And the key issue, I think, here is longevity and clonality. in that we have these three words, annual, biennial, and perennial, and that's the same across most European languages. It's a very crude categorization. Nature does not work in nice, clearly defined categories. Nature always has a gradient between extremes, and that's a much better way of understanding a lot of nature. Between black and white, there are endless shades of grey. So we have, on one hand, these ephemeral annuals that only last a few months, such as the hairy bittercress that comes free with every plant from a nursery. We have longer-lived annuals. We have annuals like calendula, which will go on for more than a year, or at least they do in the kind of mild climate of the west of the British Isles. We have biennials. Then this category of short-lived perennials, which includes quite a lot of species that are sold as perennials. These are plants that have a short fuse. They are genetically programmed to be short-lived. But by being sold as perennials, they create a great deal of misunderstanding. And then we have longer-lived perennials. And the crucial dividing line, which is a pretty clear one, is that of clonality, that there are plants we use which are non-clonal and which tend to be short-lived and therefore have to reproduce from seed, and those that are clonal, that spread themselves vegetatively. And as we say, you're never alone with a clone. The clones will keep on going. And so in the workshop, one of the key things we do is to try to get participants to recognize the clonality of plants. And if they recognize something as clonal, then they can be pretty sure that that will be a long-lived species in their planting. One of the species I use as a sort of model is Nautia macedonica, which a lot of people are familiar with as a plant bought in garden centres and nurseries. And these very striking flowers, and after a number of years, it dies, and they blame themselves, or they blame the slugs, or they blame the soil, or whatever. They try it again, and realize after a while, yes, this is one of those short-lived perennials. Maximum lifespan, 5 years, usually much less. And I encourage participants to look at the plant. It's got this very, very tight tuft of foliage, which if you sort of peel it back, you can begin to get this sense that this is not a plant that's going to spread itself vegetatively. There's no sign here of any shoots that are rooting into the substrate. And if we indeed dig a plant up, give it a good wash, we can see it's got this taproot, and we can see shoots, but none of these shoots have their own independent roots. So none of them will function as potentially independent plants. So this is something we can be pretty certain is going to be non-clonal, and because it's non-clonal, there's a very strong chance that this is going to be short-lived. So this is, more than anything with participants in the workshop, this is the key thing I try to get across, to recognize that there are such things as short-lived perennials. And so long as you know they're short-lived and you make allowances for them, that doesn't actually matter. A lot of them are grown for very good reasons, but they are not necessarily suitable for longer-term projects unless you can be pretty confident that they can regenerate through seeding. And this is come back to my Dutch colleague Piet Oudolf. This is one of the reasons why he has been so successful, because over the years, through growing the plants himself, he knows he has been able to winnow out those short-lived species. So now there's very few short-lived non-clonal perennials used in Oudolf mixes. Aquilegia vulgaris is another example. We flag up, again, a very familiar plant with this limited lifespan. And again, it's that one point of connection between the shoots and the roots. No sign here of clonality. Spread, will it take over? Getting participants to recognize that there are different patterns to the spread of clonal perennials. Mostly this so-called phalanx moving out regularly. The guerrilla spreaders are unpredictable, sometimes very useful, but with a much more unpredictable spread. I was doing 2 workshops in the Czech Republic last year, in Prohonice, and you illustrate this by talking about this is the Vladimir Putin approach. This here is the Leonid. This is the Leonid Brezhnev sending in the tanks. Kerenga Shoma palmata, nice example of a slow establishing perennial. And from looking at this plant, you can pretty well guess what's going on underground, can't you? You can be pretty sure that under here there are rhizomes and that this is marching out phalanx style a few centimeters a year. And I always try to get participants to think underground. If they can't dig a plant up, you can kind of imagine what's going on underground here. Very important to get that sense of, 50% at least of the plant is below ground, and very often that's what is happening. And that's what I mean by the rabbit's eye view. It's about looking at this kind of zone of the plant here to really understand the nature of its clonality. Guerrilla spreaders can be very useful in insinuating themselves between other clumps of established plants. Amateur gardeners are sometimes frightened of them, the way that they make their own minds up about where they're going to grow, but in a larger planting they can be extremely useful for getting this sense of spontaneity. And in difficult environments, and I had a phase of working as a planting consultant for Bristol City Council and planting out roundabouts outside the Lidl store, etc. And these rapidly spreading guerrilla spreaders such as Euphorbia cyparissius can be extremely good at filling gaps. Every now and again somebody drives over this, and perennials that can spread quickly enough to fill gaps, to self-repair, are very good for difficult urban environments. Persistence. Does a perennial hold on to territory? This is one of the reasons why that we find that some varieties indeed fail in cultivation. Those that spread and then, in fact, the older growth rapidly dies back and the whole clump breaks up. This does very often result in weaker, gappy growth. And in some environments, particularly light soils, these can be successful, but very often they're not. So again, this is one of the things that you want to flag up as a sign of something for people to look out for. On the other hand, we have those that can be almost extraordinarily aggressive. And I always use Lysimachia punctata as my example for workshop participants. This is one of the only plants you can actually throw this out of the car window and come back 5 years later and find this. This is taken in Western Scotland. This is one of the few plants that will actually establish almost an alien monoculture in the British countryside. And it's a good way of flagging up all the various aspects that go for really successful clonality. And it's quite useful here to get one of the participants. I won't do this now, I'll spare you this. But when I'm doing the workshop for real, somebody gets dragged out from the front. I have to stand there and say, well, how many old flowering stems are there? How many new flowering stems? How long do you think those stems are? And just work our way through. So this is a plant that has a rapid rate of increase from one year to another. Each new shoot is several centimeters long, and that's fundamentally most important. The center of the plant is extraordinarily dense. It's a mixture of the kind of woody tissue and these fibrous roots. So this is clearly a plant that is going to hold on to the territory it is rapidly conquering. So that's Lysimachia punctata, a good example of a kind of extreme end of a spectrum of behavior. And through understanding this, we can help workshop participants to understand better the various aspects that make up clonality and vegetative spread. Now, what time of year we run the workshop and the materials has quite a crucial role to play. If you do it in the winter, you can, obviously you don't have the top growth of the plant, but the root structure is clearly visible, and you can poke around with in container-grown plants and get a good sense of what's going on at that crucial connection between the shoots and the roots. And I ran a workshop in Kiev in Ukraine, winter before last, sort of total sub-zero temperatures outside, but we got a good load of plants in from a nursery, and this worked very well. It works particularly well when you've got plants in containers. You don't particularly want to be sort of poking around gardens in Kiev in December. It's also very realistic. Using nursery-grown container plants is actually very realistic in terms of what course the plant material that course participants are likely to meet. In spring, it's kind of ideal time, really, because everything's growing, and you can go around a garden or a park, or a botanical garden, and you can look at plants and get a very clear idea of what's going on. Isn't it so much top growth that it actually obscures what's going on underneath? Later on in the year, there are advantages in seeing the full biomass of the plant, but very often that actually obscures what's going on underneath, and you have to get students to kind of plough in and pull plants back, and in a botanical garden or public place, that's not always a very good idea. So there's advantages and disadvantages to doing this workshop at different times of year, and there's pluses and minuses. And crucial is getting people on hands and knees looking at what is going on at ground level, the rabbit's eye view. No one would let a real rabbit into their garden for this photograph, so we had to use a toy rabbit. And there we are. There we have students getting the rabbit's eye view. Groups vary in how willing they are to get down on hands and knees. Some of the landscape architects have to be rather kind of forced down. Whereas the keen plants people are only too keen to get down and get some dirt under their fingernails. Lysimachia clethroides, firecracker in spring. You can get a very nice clear idea here of guerrilla spread vis-a-vis the more predictable phalanx clumps of Solidago and Geranium species. Here we are for a seminar eco-landscape at the Moscow Agricultural University with students looking at container-grown plants. One of the exercises I do in the winter, this is at Sheffield University, one of the exercises we do in the winter is I power wash soil off plant roots and take along the plant roots, and people get a real kick out of this, actually seeing what's going on underground, seeing the parts of a plant you don't normally see, and getting a much more balanced perspective on how a plant actually functions. Chinese students are always really fun because when it comes to questions, one of the first questions that comes up is, can you eat it? And that foraging that we're only just rediscovering is, so much more deep within that culture. And in some cases, you can get a very clear idea of a plant's long-term performance. Aruncus dioecious, that extraordinarily dense network of fibrous roots. Very clearly, this is a plant that is going to totally dominate its immediate root environment, which is not necessarily something you appreciate simply looking at top growth. And so, increasingly, I'm using these photographs of plants taken during winter in the workshops to get people to look beyond what they see immediately. And finally, we can extend this garden-based workshop to working in natural or semi-natural managed environments. This was just a couple of weeks ago, actually at a literary festival. Everywhere in Britain now has a literary festival. And this was a countryside and gardening themed one up in Yorkshire. And we are working on this little bit of wildflower meadow behind the organiser's house. And it's about getting students on their hands and knees basically looking at grass growth and looking at these issues of clonality and non-clonality in the wilder environment. So that is my attempt to produce a one-day enjoyable workshop for garden and landscape professionals to really try to help people to read the plant, to get down on hands and knees and to make their own decisions about how a plant might perform long-term by by trying to understand better its physical features at that rabbit's eye view level. Thank you.